I would like to introduce you today to John Weicher. John is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Housing and Financial Markets at Hudson Institute. From 2001 to 2005, John Weicher served as Assistant Secretary for Housing and Federal Housing Commissioner at HUD, with responsibility for 3,400 staff and $500 billion of FHA mortgage insurance. His major initiatives included regulatory reform of the real estate settlement process, mission regulation of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and establishing a risk-based premium structure for FHA's multifamily mortgage insurance. He previously served as Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at HUD and as Chief Economist at both HUD and OMB. John is the author of 14 books and the author of numerous popular and scholarly articles. His latest book, which you will be able to purchase from our shop page, is Housing Policy at a Crossroads: The Why, How, and Who of Assistance Programs. And previously, he was chief author of Rebuilding the Research Capacity at HUD, the report of the National Research Council Committee. So welcome, John Weicher.
Thank you, Nan. Thank you very much.
Now, you worked at HUD, and that was certainly a part of what you had done prior to the Hudson Institute.
Yes,
why don't you tell me how you got involved with HUD?
Well, it's a bit of a story. I did my graduate work in economics at the University of Chicago, and I grew up in the neighborhood next to the university. And in graduate school, I was living at home, but both the area I lived in and the university area were deteriorating. And I began to wonder what was going on and what could be done about it. There were several. It happened that the university had started an urban renewal project, recognizing that it had neighborhood problems, and several of the faculty members were interested in the urban renewal project. And so I talked to one of them and decided to write a dissertation on, in my case, the effect of the project on the cost of local government services in the neighborhood and in the city as a whole. Okay, I completed that. I was teaching at Ohio State, teaching economics, and a faculty member at the University of Chicago, a business school professor who I knew slightly, had asked me, would I be willing to write a paper, a monograph for them on urban renewal for a project they had on looking at various government programs and how they were working out. And I said, sure. Now this is 1972, and I wrote the paper and I submitted it. And separately, I decided after 5 years at Ohio State, I was interested in going to Washington, seeing what was going on down there. And so I was invited to take a visiting position at the Office of Economic Opportunity. So I went down there in August of 1972. And that fall, first of all, my book came out. Second of all, President Nixon got reelected, and he announced the day afterwards that the government was getting too big, and so he was going to set an example by cutting the size of his office in half. Okay. A few days later, somebody figured out that the president's office consisted of two units: the Office of Management and Budget and the Office of Economic Opportunity. And what he meant was he was getting rid of the Office of Economic Opportunity. And so all of my colleagues and me and everybody else was suddenly worried that we were all going to be out of a job. And in fact, he did abolish the agency, and various people. It was a very complicated process, but eventually everybody was assigned to one or another government agency, more or less randomly, because the union had said you cannot put these people at risk of losing employment by this policy. Okay, so for some reason, I got assigned to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. But I was promptly traded to HUD for a sociologist at the same grade level who did not want to be at HUD. He wanted to be at HEW, and so we switched. So I was at HEW for, I think, 3 weeks. Meanwhile, Secretary Romney, as he was leaving office, said to the president, our housing programs, our urban programs are not working very well, and I think you should get rid of them all and start over, develop a new set of policies and programs. The president said, fine. Secretary Jim Lynn became the secretary of HUD. He didn't have a housing background, but he was a very able lawyer. He had been deputy secretary of commerce. And so he started to put together a policy office, and I got asked to come over there and be part of it because of my urban renewal work. And that's how I got to HUD the first time as a staff economist working on this project. And it went on for 6 months in 1973, from March to September. And this had been I'd gotten married the summer before, and we moved down to Washington. And my wife told me after all this was done that it took her several months to realize that when I came home from the office in a blue funk, I was not mad at her. And so then she said she didn't worry about it very much. Okay, well, that was 47 years ago, and we're still married. But I learned that I was not the only person who came home in a blue funk. When I've told this story from time to time, other people, the wives of other people who were there at the time have come and said, you should have, I had the same experience with Fred or Joe, and would tell me their version of that story. So that's how I got to HUD. And it was working on that study, which went on and on and on. And of course, as time went on, the president was more concerned about being impeached and so on. But so it went on, and eventually out of it came the 1974 Act, which replaced 235 and 236 with the idea of a housing with Section 8, both new and existing. And existing was, of course, the new element, and replaced urban renewal with the community development block grant. And so Secretary Romney got his way, in a sense, and we were then trying to put these new programs in place. Secretary Lynn, when President Ford came into office, Secretary Lynn went over to the White House as OMB director, and Carla Hills became the secretary, and I worked with her for the rest of President Ford's term as we put the programs in place. The law was passed before she came into office, but she took as her responsibility getting them up and running, and she did, and that's what we did.
Did you get rid of your blue funk?
Yeah, eventually. But I tell you, I went back and forth between Washington and Columbus for a couple more times before finally deciding in 1977 that I was probably better suited to be in Washington than I was to continue to be an academic economist. And I've been here since then.
And did you ever think that what you created way back then would become as big as it is today, with the Housing Voucher Program being the primary subsidized housing vehicle for the country?
Well, I tell you, I was new, and the thought that we were going to replace all of those programs with new programs, it took me a little while to realize that this was very unusual. So I thought, oh, good, we're going to replace all these programs with new programs. That'll be quite interesting. Well, yes, it was, but interesting in ways that I wasn't that expecting that much. But by the time I left, I didn't quite know what I was expecting. But I thought we had put some good ideas in place, and CDBG and the voucher program are still there, although CDBG is kind of tottering, I think, at this point.
Well, the voucher program certainly was a stroke of genius in many ways because it made such a difference to families getting away from the project-based housing because they always had a stigma attached
Mm-hmm.
if they were, or usually did, if they were in public housing, giving that address. And by giving the voucher program with that, the ability for them to choose where they lived and not have that stigma, that was huge. So did you help design that? I mean, it was such a marvelous contribution.
Yes, but I certainly could not claim a lot of credit for that, for the specifics of that program. I didn't know enough as I came in there to know how the specifics of a program like that were, what was workable and what was not. You come in thinking, okay, I want to do X. I don't like what the previous guys did. I think they did it. I don't think they did the right thing. I want to do this, and it takes you a while to learn why the previous guys did things the way they did. And maybe it was because they were left-wing loons or right-wing nuts, depending on who was there first. And maybe it was because that was the only way, that was the best way to get whatever you were trying to do done, regardless of whether you were a loon or a nut or whatever you were. You had to learn how you could make things work. And it might not be the way you thought you could make them work when you came in. So I learned a lot.
How long did you stay there? At what point did you leave HUD?
Well, I was there from early '73 to late '74, and then I went back to Ohio State. I had been on a leave, and I went back to Ohio State. Okay, 6-8 months later, I got asked if I would want to come back to HUD as chief economist. Now, I'd been in the economics office, and the guy I'd worked with, Rudy Penner, went on to be chief economist at OMB and then CBO director and so on, and we've been good friends ever since. So I felt that, yeah, I'd like to go back and do that. And I worked with Secretary Hills for the rest of President Ford's term, from something like July of 1975 to the end of '76, beginning of '77. Then I was at the Urban Institute for several years, and then I was at AEI for about 6 years. In between there, I worked on President Reagan's Commission on Housing, which was actually a commission on the housing finance system because of all the problems the SNLs were having in '80, '81, but which also was recommending the voucher program as the program, which was going somewhat farther than President Nixon and President Ford had gone. And so I worked on that for about a year. Then I was at AEI full time, and then in the fall of '87, I was invited to come to OMB as their chief economist. And from there, and I was also worked on another couple of housing committees. And the end of all this was that early in 1989, Jack Kemp asked me to come to HUD as Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research. And so I was there from '89 to '93, not there from '93 to '01, and then came in as FHA Commissioner from '01 to '05. One of the things I did with Jack Kemp was develop conduct a study of the financial solvency of FHA, working with Price Waterhouse. And that got me interested in how FHA worked and what they were doing. And I felt I could, the opportunity in '01, I felt I could come back and do the job of managing FHA and I did for President Bush's first term.
So you have worked with a lot of presidents.
Yeah, well, mostly with a lot of secretaries. But not so closely with the various presidents. They had other things to do. The collapse of the Soviet Union, for one.
Yes, but let's say that even working with a lot of governmental policies, which change from president to president.
Yeah.
Which era was really your favorite? If you went back and said, if I had it to go do over and jump back into an era, this is the one I would do.
I don't think of it in those terms. I worked with 5 secretaries, and they all brought something to the job, and they all contributed to HUD in significant ways. And I learned from each of them in turn. And I don't regret any of the any of the time I spent there, and I certainly have no regrets about working with the people that I worked with. So I don't think of it in those terms.
Contrasting it, how did you feel about your experience at OMB?
That was challenging, and I certainly enjoyed it. The problem of being chief economist at OMB is you need to be developing the budget framework for the next fiscal year, for the next fiscal year's budget. And so I worked on the frameworks for the 1989-1990 fiscal year budgets. And in between, the job is whatever the director of OMB wants you to do. And so I worked on various somewhat economic issues, mostly for Jim Miller, who was the OMB director for the end of the Reagan administration, last half of the Reagan, President Reagan's two terms. So I worked on a number of other things there, but the basic job was the economic framework for the budget, and that meant a lot of work in the 3-4 months leading up to the publication of the budget, including the last all-nighter I ever pulled in the spring of 1989.
So people may not realize that OMB stands for Office of Management and Budget, and that I assume that what you mean by budget is not HUD's budget, but the entire government's.
That's right. I should have been more clear about that. Yeah, it was the budget of the United States. You work on that framework for it. And that becomes the framework that everybody is supposed to work within in the different agencies. Okay, if this is the budget framework, then we need, and the economic framework that we expect to work in, then this is what we have, how we go. And that becomes the framework that people operate within. And
so
that's the job.
What year was that, John?
Well, I went there in November of 1987. And so I worked on the budget that came out in February of 1988, which was the fiscal '89 budget. And then I was there for the next year, the last year of President Reagan's time in office. And so it was the same thing. You started working in the fall of 1988, and that was the budget, which President Reagan's last budget, which was for fiscal year 1990.
So I'm curious to see the difference in the budget. Do you happen to remember the amount of the budget back then?
Lord, no. It was smaller than it is at this point.
Curious at the difference, between 1990 and now, with inflation and,
Oh yeah, everything else. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I can't come up with. I can't come up with it.
Too many years ago. So, what would you consider of all of the work that you have done? What would you consider your best success story?
Two or three things. I think the work we did in 1973-74 that led to the '74 Act, where CDBG came into play and was created, and the what turned into the voucher program was created. That was substantial. and maybe that would be the most fundamental thing. The 74 Act, I think, doesn't get a lot of credit for the changes that it created, put HUD in a new direction. Working on the financial solvency of FHA was a challenge, and I enjoyed it, and we were successful in getting a framework in place for keeping track of the financial solvency of FHA, and they've been doing annual actuarial studies since then. The other day, for some reason unrelated to this, I happened to look at the latest study of the MMI fund. This was the single family side that we were looking at only, but that's a big deal. So I'd include that as something substantial that we did. Maybe those two. I was involved in GSE regulation twice at HUD, and that was important and substantial. Maybe those three.
What was the GSE regulation?
Well, as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as you remember, the housing finance system was really in bad shape. The S&Ls were really in bad shape. The late 1970s, early 1980s, and legislation to shore them up in the early 80s didn't, in fact, hold through the full decade. And so when President Bush came in 1989, one of the issues was, what do we do about the housing finance system? What do we do about the savings and loans? And it was in that context when they passed the savings and loan reconstruction bill in 88, 89. And now I can't remember the acronym for that. Shame on me. The next thing that happened was GAO came out with a study saying that FHA could be in trouble if they didn't expand the range of people that they were helping. If they didn't raise the maximum mortgage limit, and that, in the context of the collapse of the S&Ls, got turned into, well, FHA is going to collapse too. And no, that wasn't what happened, but it also got, well, okay, what happens to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? And what happens to the home loan banks? And so out of that came legislation to reform the regulation of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And that was in place for 15 years until the issue became front page in 2004, when both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac turned out to have financial problems, and that led to 15 years later, the Federal Housing Finance Agency is still managing them much more closely than they were managed, and much than they were overseen before. And you can pick up until the last few weeks, until the virus took over the news. You could see stories regularly about what the administration was thinking about doing after 15 years of having Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac essentially as agencies of the government. What were they going to do about returning them to the semi-private sector, or what were they going to do, period?
What do you think they should do?
Well, I think they should either be fully public or fully private. And you can make a case for either of those. FHA is fully public and hasn't had the problems that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have had, although they've had their problems from time to time. And I think you could make a case that having them as public would make sense. You could make a case on having them as private, in which case you would have shareholders and traders evaluating how they were doing. And that kind of market discipline would perhaps be stronger than having them semi-public and semi-private. It's it's been an awkward relationship over the years, I think, and I think that's the fundamental thing to be resolved.
Why hasn't somebody just done that to date, John?
Too many people have too many. There are too many aspects of it that people are concerned about. Who are you trying to help? There have been concerns about housing goals for lower and moderate income home buyers and for rental housing for lower and moderate income households. That's been a policy concern. I think this is fair to say, going back to Secretary Patricia Roberts Harris. And so you have issues about where do you draw the line there? What is public, what is private, and people will draw that line in different places. You have questions about to what extent does Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have to have the capital resources to withstand a downturn, and that gets to be an issue that people have argued over at intervals since the 80s. There's so many aspects of these, and there is so much money at stake that it's been very difficult to ever work out a framework that was satisfactory for a period of time. And they wound up now with the federal government for the time being, at least.
Being an economist, you'd be a good person to ask the question. We're in the early stages of the virus. What effect do you think that's going to have on the economy? And do you think it'll affect things like housing prices, or do you think it will affect, in general, what effect?
Well, I think it's could have several effects, and we've had a lot of experience with plagues, if you will, of one kind or another. The worst in our history being the Spanish influenza right after the end of World War I. And one of the consequences of that was a very sharp depression right after the end of the war, which we rebounded from in the early 1920s. And it's been sort of lost in the shuffle because the Great Depression in 29-33 was bigger than that. But it was a hell of a problem for the people living through that at the time. My wife has a great uncle who came home from World War I and promptly died of the Spanish flu. She didn't know him, of course, but that was the story that an awful lot of people came back with. We had more of our soldiers killed by influenza than killed by the Germans and Austrians during the war. So that was very serious. I suppose we could have something like that. It could also be that it's something that we get on top of a lot sooner. Then there wasn't that much to do with Spanish influenza except put up with it. We didn't have that ability to deal with it. I think a lot of work is going into trying to deal with this new virus, and I don't think it's going to be. My guess is, and I am no kind of specialist in this, my guess is it's not going to have the same kind of economic impact that the Spanish flu had. But I think this is not going to be a lot of fun for very many people to go through with. We've had flu epidemics of one kind and another that have been problems, and we've seen them for a period of time and made a real difference in the economy for a period of time. And Lord knows the rest of the world has had them too. We'll see where this goes, but the one thing I'm doing is sitting tight and not panicking financially, and we'll find out if I should have panicked or not. Ask me in 5 years.
Isn't that always the truth? Our hindsight is always our 20/20 vision.
Yeah.
Well, and there's a little bit difference maybe now because of the mobility of people versus the mobility of people back then. When
Mhm.
you think about the worldwide influence with the media talking about it constantly from a worldwide perspective, and
Mhm.
people that have traveled worldwide, what do you think the difference is between 1918 and now in the global impact of it?
Well, I think the global impact is likely to be bigger because we are a much more closely knit globe than we were. World War One was a problem in Europe and North America in particular, and that the as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on this, the flu was a problem in North America and in Europe in particular. Although we've had literally world epidemics going farther back. In the 14th century, we had what was known as the Black Death, which started in Asia and made huge inroads into Europe, and it wiped out something like a third of the population of Western Europe. So we haven't had anything like that. I don't think. You really should get a public health specialist in here on this. But I think we know a lot more about where to start. And it's going to take a while to get this under control. And meanwhile, I think people are looking out the window at people who are walking by and staying away from each other as they're walking on the sidewalk in front of our house. And I think that's going to be. I think we're going to be careful. And hope that we find ways we find vaccines and we find treatments.
Tell me a little bit about the Hudson Institute. Tell me what you do there. How did it get formed?
Sure. Hudson was founded by Herman Kahn, who was one of the leading public intellectuals, leading thinkers of the 70s and 80s. At one point, he shared the cover of Time magazine with Henry Kissinger, and he was a man who had a lot of original ideas. He had worked at the Rand Corporation, and he did a lot of work on such issues. Is the book that I think he's most famous for is called On Thermonuclear War, which was not something people were wanting to think about or write about at that time, and aren't that thrilled to be thinking about it now or since then. But he wrote serious books on complicated subjects, and he eventually set up this think tank in his barn in Croton-on-Hudson, New York, hence the title. He was from New York, and this was his. This was where he set up shop, and he covered a lot of territory. The one and only time I met him, he came to HUD when I was there the first time because he had come to the conclusion that there were some serious problems in the housing finance system. This was before it had really become a nationally recognized problem, and he came in and wanted to talk to people about it. And a group of economists and a few other people were talking to him. And he started talking at a fairly unsophisticated level until he realized that a number of people in the room had been giving serious thought to this issue. And suddenly the level of his discourse just moved to a much more sophisticated approach. And it was an impressive discussion, well worth having. He died in 1984. And he had established an institution that had more in it than just himself and his immediate colleagues. And the Lilly Endowment in Indianapolis provided incentives to move the headquarters to Indianapolis. They had a program, as they described it, of giving back to the community in which they had made their money. And that included establishing a very impressive children's museum, and it included bringing the Baltimore Colts to Indianapolis to become the Indianapolis Colts, and including bringing Hudson Institute there. We were headquartered there for 20 years. We had a Washington office for a while. We had a New York office as well, and ultimately in 2005, the decision was made that while we did some very interesting work on the state level. I was involved in a project to reform the Wisconsin welfare system, which was worthwhile, and a project to reform the property tax reversion system in the state of Michigan, which had been set up in 1893 as a way of preventing farmers who had a bad crop year from losing their property, to protect them from foreclosure on their farm, which had years later turned into Detroit has an awful lot of abandoned property, and how on earth do you get it back into public use when the system is set up to prevent anybody from taking it away? Well, if the owner doesn't want the property, that's not helpful. And we did get a recommendation which the legislature adopted on a bipartisan basis, and it's, from what I know, been effective since then. And I've talked to people who were there. Several of the present members of Congress from Michigan were there at the time and were involved in it. Senator Peters, for example, Congressman Kildee. So we had this, but a lot of our focus was foreign policy and defense. And this is the best place to be doing foreign policy and defense. And we consolidated here, and we've been here since 2000. We've been here as our headquarters since 2005-06 back then, and we still are.
And here is Washington, D.C.
I'm sorry, yes, here is Washington, D.C. Sorry.
So you are director of the Center for Housing and Financial Markets, and yet you're saying the Hudson Institute is involved also in defense policy. Did I hear you say that?
Yes, and yes, it is. And you can say the same thing about the American Enterprise Institute. You can say it about the Brookings Institute. You can say it about the Heritage Institute. You can say it about the think tanks in Washington. There are specialized think tanks, but there are also think tanks which cover a very broad range of topics. And we are one of those. We have people whose interests are domestic, and people whose interests are foreign policy, and people whose interest is defense. We've had people who are concerned about 5G. We've got a broad spectrum, and I find my colleagues very interesting to talk to and listen to. And we have people who we have sessions, discussions all the time. We've got several people writing about the coronavirus at this point, who's from various angles, not necessarily the pure public health example, but the foreign angle, but the foreign policy angle. What does this involve? What's been happening affect our relations with China, the Middle East, our relations with Western Europe, you name it.
So, as being director of the Center for Housing and Financial Markets, what would you say is the future in that area? What would that look like?
Well, I think the thing I've been working on mostly the last few years has been the distribution of wealth within the United States. And I got into that from the housing background because the equity we have in our homes is our biggest asset as a society. Not all of us are homeowners, about 65% of us are homeowners, but it's our biggest asset as a society. And so what we've had problems, as we know, with the changes in the housing market, the ups and the downs in the housing markets. We certainly have problems with the ups and downs in the financial markets. Right now, we're having them every day. I have to say, you don't track the wealth of American households from day to day. The most useful data source is a survey every 3 years conducted by the Federal Reserve Board of about 8,000 households, asking a lot of questions. And that's basically the most useful data I find for looking at it. But what we've had since the Great Recession, we've had a very weak recovery, a slow recovery, I think. And the result, that's been what I've been focusing on for the last several years.
So what would you say the prognosis is for the stock market today, looking at what's the volatility of it?
I am personally taking the advice of Warren Buffett, which was that in what I can't remember which cyclical downturn he was referring to at this case, but he sat tight. So he didn't lose any money because he didn't sell anything. And I think that it's prudent to, if you thought your investments were a good idea, maybe they still are, maybe some of them aren't, but I'm not here to give stock market advice. But I think that when we come out of this, we'll be in a position to make a better judgment as to where we're going forward. Right now, it's getting through this, and Lord, the stock market goes up, down, up, down, up, down, and I just I don't look at what of our investments are going up or down on that basis. That way madness lies. It's just not worth it.
How long does it usually take a market when they've had a financial downturn to rebound? Are there any kind of economist rules of thumb or anything about that?
I don't think there are. There are responses which are abrupt. The other serious. We've had two post-war recessions that were really sharp. One was in 1980, 81, 82. The other was the Great Recession in 07, 08, 09. They both were severe. We hit bottom in the fall of 1982, and within a year and a half, we were far enough out of it to the point that people were not anticipating that there was going to be any kind of immediate downturn. We were doing quite well. The recession that started at the end of 07 hit bottom in the summer of 09, and it seemed to a lot of people that it was, and that includes me, it was taking an awful long time to come back from it. I think we have, but I think it was not the kind of recovery that we had after the 80, 81, 82 recession. So and the Great Depression went on for years. That's most of a decade. Pardon me.
So it's kind of wait and see.
Yeah.
John, you've had a fabulous career. I mean, you've done so many different things. The breadth of it is amazing. And, I think it's great that we have people like you that have been able to stay with it this long and seen the different factors of it. When you talk about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and FHA, the start of the 1974 Act with the changeover into Section 8, you've lived through so many interesting things. And your involvement still today in the Hudson Institute. It's wonderful that you have given that kind of public service all these years.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed what I've done, and I'm happy I did it. There are a few things I'd like to do over again, but I'm generally pleased with what I've done.
You don't live this long without having a few do-overs.
Oh yes, yes, no, yeah,
At least
yeah.
once.
Tell me about it.
Do-over.
Yeah. There are. Yes, there are. Yes, there are.
Me too. I understand.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time and all of your interesting thoughts. Really appreciate the history that you've given us.
No, thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I'm looking forward to the conversations you're having with some of my former colleagues. I've heard some, and I expect to hear others, and I expect to enjoy them.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.